Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I used to believe that no matter how complicated life became, family would always be the one place where you could breathe without holding your guard up. That belief stayed with me for most of my 34 years, even through heartbreaks, disappointments, and the quiet loneliness that settled into my evenings like an uninvited guest. My younger sister, Alina, had always been the center of attention growing up. She was beautiful in that effortless way, large eyes, soft voice, and a smile that could make strangers trust her within seconds. I was different. I was the steady one, the practical one, the one people called strong, which I learned early on was just another way of saying they expected me not to complain when I was hurting. When Alina got engaged 2 years ago, our parents treated it like a royal wedding announcement. I remember sitting at the dining table that night while my mother clapped her hands with excitement, and my father kept repeating how proud he was that his younger daughter had settled her future. No one said anything to me directly, but I could feel their glances sliding toward me like quiet reminders that I was still unmarried, still alone, still somehow unfinished in their eyes. It wasn't that I didn't want love. I had loved once, deeply, foolishly, completely. But that story had ended in a way that left me with more scars than memories worth keeping. After that, I stopped chasing the idea of marriage like it was some finish line. I focused on my career, built a stable life, and learned to find small joys in quiet routines. But in my family, especially with Alina, being single wasn't seen as independence, it was seen as failure. When she got pregnant barely 6 months after her wedding, the celebrations only grew louder. My mother started calling her every day, asking about cravings and baby names, while I became the reliable helper who picked up groceries, handled appointments, and quietly paid for things when expenses piled up. I didn't mind helping. I loved my sister, or at least I thought I did. The baby shower was planned for a Sunday afternoon in my parents' house, decorated in soft pastel colors, with ribbons hanging from the ceiling and a big banner that read, "Welcome, Little Miracle." I arrived early, carrying a carefully wrapped gift, a handmade quilt I had spent weeks sewing. Each stitch held my silent hope that this baby would bring warmth into our family, maybe even soften the distance that had been growing between Alina and I. She was sitting in the living room surrounded by cousins when I walked in. Her face lit up briefly when she saw me, but the warmth faded quickly, replaced by that familiar expression, half smile, half something else I could never quite name. "Oh, good," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "My single, free, career woman sister is here. At least someone has time to show up early." A few people laughed politely, and I forced a small smile, pretending it didn't sting. I told myself it was just her pregnancy hormones. That's what everyone kept saying whenever she snapped at someone or made a sharp comment. As the house filled with relatives and neighbors, the noise grew louder, laughter, plates clinking, the smell of sweet desserts filling the air. I tried to stay busy helping in the kitchen, but every now and then I would hear bits of conversation drifting in from the living room. "You know how lucky Alina is. She got everything, husband, home, baby, at the right time." Another voice replied, "Yes, unlike some people who wait too long and miss their chance." I knew they were talking about me, but I kept stirring the tea as if I hadn't heard a word. The real humiliation came later when it was time for Alina to open her gifts. Everyone gathered around her, cameras ready, voices cheerful. She unwrapped each present with exaggerated excitement, thanking people loudly. When she reached mine, she held up the quilt, running her fingers over the stitched patterns. For a brief moment, her expression softened, and I felt a flicker of relief. Then she laughed, a sharp, mocking laugh that didn't sound like the sister I remembered from childhood. "Wow," she said, raising her voice so the entire room could hear. "This must be what you do when you have too much free time and no husband or children to care for." The room went silent for a second before a few awkward cuckles broke out. My face burned so intensely I felt dizzy. I tried to laugh it off, but my throat felt tight, like I was swallowing glass. She wasn't done. She looked straight at me, her eyes cold. "You know," she added, "maybe you should focus less on sewing baby blankets and more on finding someone before it's too late. I wouldn't want you to end up alone forever." I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. My hands trembled, but I kept them folded tightly in my lap so no one would notice. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and escape the dozens of eyes watching me. But what hurt most wasn't the words themselves. It was the cruelty in her voice, the way she seemed to enjoy the power of humiliating me in front of everyone. I had spent years defending her, supporting her, forgiving her selfishness. In that moment, something inside me cracked quietly. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just sat there, silent, while the party noise slowly resumed around me like nothing had happened. And that's when the doorbell rang. The sound of the doorbell cut through the chatter like a sudden crack of thunder, sharp enough to make several people pause mid-conversation. My mother, who had been fussing over a tray of sweets, called out for someone to answer it, but the younger cousins were too busy filming Alina opening gifts. I don't know why, but I found myself standing up automatically, grateful for any excuse to step away from the suffocating weight of that room. My legs felt unsteady as I walked down the hallway, each step echoing louder than it should have, as if my body was still trembling from the humiliation I had just endured. I remember thinking that whoever stood behind that door had no idea they were about to walk into a house thick with tension and unspoken discomfort. When I opened it, the first thing I saw was a little girl, no older than 4, clutching a small stuffed rabbit to her chest. Her hair was tied into uneven pigtails, and she wore a pink dress with a stain near the hem, as though she had spilt juice on herself earlier. She looked up at me with wide, curious eyes, the kind children have when they're unsure whether to smile or stay cautious. Beside her stood a man, tall, with tired eyes, and the kind of expression people carry when they've been holding on to something heavy for too long. He looked at me for a brief moment, then passed me into the house, his jaw tightening as if he were bracing himself. "Is Alina here?" he asked quietly. His voice was calm, but there was a tension underneath it that made my stomach twist. I nodded slowly, still confused, still trying to place why he seemed vaguely familiar. "Yes, she's inside," I said. The little girl tugged gently at his hand and whispered, loud enough for me to hear, "Daddy, is Mommy inside?" The word hit me like ice water poured down my spine. Mommy? I stared at the man, then at the child, my mind racing to understand what I had just heard. Before I could say anything else, he gave a small nod of thanks and stepped past me into the hallway. The little girl walked beside him, her small shoes tapping softly against the floor. By the time they entered the living room, the cheerful noise had faded into confused murmurs. I followed slowly, my heart beating so hard it felt like it might crack my ribs. The moment Alina saw them, the color drained from her face so quickly it was almost frightening. The smile she had been wearing vanished, replaced by something raw and panicked. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, though the room was so quiet everyone heard her. The man didn't answer immediately. He stood there for a moment, his hand resting protectively on the little girl's shoulder. Then he spoke in a voice steady but filled with pain. "I thought it was time," he said. "You told me you were going to tell your family yourself, but it's been years, Alina. She deserves to know her mother." A ripple of shock spread through the room like a silent explosion. My mother let out a small gasp. One of the aunts dropped a spoon that clattered loudly onto the floor. I could feel my own breath growing shallow as the truth began to piece itself together in my mind, each realization heavier than the last. The little girl looked around nervously, then locked her eyes on Alina. Her face lit up with innocent excitement. "Mommy!" she called out, her voice bright and full of love. She pulled free from the man's hand and ran toward my sister, arms stretched wide. But Alina didn't move to catch her. She just stood there frozen, her lips trembling, her eyes darting toward the crowd watching her. The child stopped halfway, confusion spreading across her face. She looked back at her father as if silently asking what she had done wrong. That moment, I don't think I will ever forget it. The raw hurt in that little girl's eyes felt sharper than anything that had been said to me earlier. The man's expression hardened. "You don't get to pretend anymore," he said quietly. "Not after everything." Alina finally found her voice, though it came out shaky and defensive. "You weren't supposed to come here," she hissed. "I told you I would handle it." "Handle it," he repeated, a bitter edge creeping into his tone. "You mean hide it, like you've been hiding her for 4 years." A wave of stunned whispers erupted around the room. My father looked as though he had aged 10 years in seconds. My mother pressed her hand over her mouth, tears already forming in her eyes. And I just stood there, my mind replaying every cruel word Alina had thrown at me earlier that afternoon. Every time she had mocked me for being single, every time she acted superior because she had the perfect life. And now, standing before all of us was the truth she had buried, a secret child, a past she had hidden so carefully that even our parents had never known. The little girl began to cry softly, the sound small and heartbreaking. She clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter, her shoulders shaking. "Daddy," she whispered, "why is Mommy mad?" The question sliced through the air like a knife. Alina's composure shattered. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but they didn't look like tears of regret. They looked like tears of fear. Fear of being exposed, of losing the image she had built so carefully. She finally knelt down slowly, her hands trembling as she reached toward the child, but the girl hesitated, her trust already cracked. Watching that scene unfold, something inside me shifted in a way I can't fully explain. The humiliation I had felt earlier began to fade, replaced by a deep, aching clarity. For years, I had thought Alina had everything I didn't. I had believed her life was perfect while mine was incomplete. But standing there, seeing the wreckage of her secret, I realized how different the truth was. And for the first time that day, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not even satisfaction, just a quiet, heavy sadness for the little girl caught in the middle of a lie that had finally crashed down. No one in that room moved for several seconds after the little girl's soft crying filled the silence. It was the kind of silence that feels thick and suffocating, like the air itself has turned heavy. I remember hearing the faint ticking of the wall clock in the hallway and realizing how strange it was that something so ordinary could sound so loud in such an extraordinary moment. Alina was still kneeling in front of the child, her hands hovering awkwardly in the air as if she didn't know whether she had the right to touch her. The girl's eyes stayed fixed on her, wide and wounded, searching for reassurance that never came. "Her name is Zara," the man said quietly, breaking the stillness. His voice carried a steady sadness, not anger, just exhaustion. "She's been asking about you for months." The name settled into the room like a fragile glass ornament placed carefully on a shelf. Zara. It was such a soft, beautiful name that it made the whole situation feel even more heartbreaking. My mother was the first to react. She took a shaky step forward, her voice trembling. "Alina, what is he talking about?" she whispered, as if speaking louder might make the truth more real. My sister didn't answer immediately. She just stared at Zara, her lips quivering, tears sliding down her cheeks in thin, silent streams. I could see the battle happening inside her, the desperate need to hold on to her carefully built image, fighting against the weight of the truth now standing right in front of her. She isn't supposed to be here," Alina said finally, her voice cracking. The words sounded wrong the moment they left her mouth. Not supposed to be here, as if a child were an inconvenience, an object that had been misplaced. Zara flinched slightly when she heard that, her small fingers tightening around the stuffed rabbit. The man's expression hardened. "She is not some mistake you can hide," he said quietly. "She's your daughter." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Even though we all already understood the situation, hearing it spoken so plainly made it feel heavier, more undeniable. I felt my chest tighten, my mind struggling to reconcile the sister I thought I knew with the woman standing before me now. 4 years ago, he continued, when you told me you weren't ready to be a mother, I respected that. You said you needed time, that your family would never accept it, that it would ruin everything. So I raised her alone. I didn't tell anyone because you begged me not to." He paused, his gaze dropping briefly to Zara, who had gone very quiet, sensing the tension without fully understanding it. "But she deserves to know her mother, and you don't get to pretend she doesn't exist because it's inconvenient for your perfect life." The words hit the room like stones thrown into still water, each one sending ripples of shock and disbelief through the faces around us. My father sank slowly into a chair, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the revelation had pressed down on him physically. He looked older than I had ever seen him. "Alina," he said hoarsely, "is this true?" My sister finally nodded, a small, broken movement. "Yes," she whispered. My mother let out a sob, covering her mouth with trembling hands. "You had a child and you never told us?" The hurt in her voice was deep, raw, almost unbearable to hear. Alina's gaze flickered nervously toward the crowd of relatives still watching. "I was scared," she said, her tone defensive now, almost pleading. "You wouldn't have understood. It would have destroyed everything. I would have lost my chances, my future." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. And in that moment, I understood exactly what she meant by future. She had hidden Zara so she could marry into a wealthier family without complications, so she could present herself as flawless, untouched by any past mistakes, so she could live the life she believed she deserved. The realization made something inside me ache, not just for the child, but for how deeply my sister had allowed fear and ambition to hollow out her humanity. Zara suddenly spoke, her voice shaky. "Did I do something bad?" she asked softly, looking up at her mother. The question broke whatever fragile composure remained in the room. Several people wiped tears from their eyes. Even my father looked away, unable to watch. Alina shook her head quickly, her voice frantic. No, you didn't do anything wrong," she said, reaching out to touch Zara's shoulder. But the girl stepped back slightly, uncertain. Watching that small movement felt like witnessing something precious crack beyond repair. I don't know what made me step forward at that moment. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the quiet part of my heart that had always protected others, even when no one protected me. I knelt down beside Zara, keeping my voice gentle. "Hey," I said softly, "you didn't do anything wrong at all." She looked at me with watery eyes, searching my face for honesty. "Really?" she whispered. I nodded, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "Really?" Slowly, hesitantly, she moved closer to me, as if drawn by the safety in my tone. When she leaned against my side, clutching her stuffed rabbit, something warm and painful spread through my chest at the same time. I could feel her tiny body trembling. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't expected. The humiliation I had felt earlier, the sharp sting of my sister's cruel words, none of it mattered. because standing there, holding a frightened little girl who had been denied love for years, I saw the truth more clearly than ever. Being single had never been my weakness, but my sister's need to appear perfect had become hers.
Zara stayed close to me, her small fingers clutching the fabric of my sleeve, as though letting go might make her disappear. I could feel the warmth of her tiny body against my arm, and the faint trembling that hadn't stopped since she walked into the room. It was a fragile kind of trust, the kind children give without knowing they're doing it, and it filled my chest with a quiet ache I couldn't ignore. Around us, the once cheerful baby shower had transformed into something unrecognizable. The pastel decorations and pink ribbons now felt strangely out of place, like props from a scene that no longer made sense. My mother sank into a chair, wiping tears from her cheeks, her voice barely audible. "How could you keep this from us for 4 years?" she whispered, her eyes fixed on Alina with a mixture of heartbreak and disbelief. My father didn't speak at first. He just stared at the floor, his hands clasped tightly together, his jaw set in a way that told me he was struggling to hold back a storm of emotions. When he finally looked up, his voice was low and heavy. "We would have helped you," he said quietly. "We would have stood by you. That's what family does." Alina's shoulders shook as she cried, but her tears felt complicated, less about remorse and more about the collapse of the image she had built so carefully. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I was barely 22 when I got pregnant. I wasn't ready. I had plans, dreams. I knew what people would say. I knew how it would look." Her eyes flickered nervously toward the relatives gathered in the room, as though their opinion still mattered more to her than the child standing only a few feet away. The man, Zara's father, let out a tired breath. "So you chose your reputation over your daughter," he said softly. There was no accusation in his tone anymore, just a quiet sadness that felt heavier than anger ever could. Alina's shoulders shook as she cried, but her tears felt complicated, less about remorse and more about the collapse of the image she had built so carefully. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I was barely 22 when I got pregnant. I wasn't ready. I had plans, dreams. I knew what people would say. I knew how it would look." Her eyes flickered nervously toward the relatives gathered in the room, as though their opinions still mattered more to her than the child standing only a few feet away. The man, Zara's father, let out a tired breath. "So you chose your reputation over your daughter," he said softly. There was no accusation in his tone anymore, just a quiet sadness that felt heavier than anger ever could. Alina's shoulders shook as she cried, but her tears felt complicated, less about remorse and more about the collapse of the image she had built so carefully. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I was barely 22 when I got pregnant. I wasn't ready. I had plans, dreams. I knew what people would say. I knew how it would look." Her eyes flickered nervously toward the relatives gathered in the room, as though their opinions still mattered more to her than the child standing only a few feet away. The man, Zara's father, let out a tired breath. "So you chose your reputation over your daughter," he said softly. There was no accusation in his tone anymore, just a quiet sadness that felt heavier than anger ever could. Alina's shoulders shook as she cried, but her tears felt complicated, less about remorse and more about the collapse of the image she had built so carefully. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I was barely 22 when I got pregnant. I wasn't ready. I had plans, dreams. I knew what people would say. I knew how it would look." Her eyes flickered nervously toward the relatives gathered in the room, as though their opinions still mattered more to her than the child standing only a few feet away. The man, Zara's father, let out a tired breath. "So you chose your reputation over your daughter," he said softly. There was no accusation in his tone anymore, just a quiet sadness that felt heavier than anger ever could. Alina's shoulders shook as she cried, but her tears felt complicated, less about remorse and more about the collapse of the image she had built so carefully. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I was barely 22 when I got pregnant. I wasn't ready. I had plans, dreams. I knew what people would say. I knew how it would look." Her eyes flickered nervously toward the relatives gathered in the room, as though their opinions still mattered more to her than the child standing only a few feet away. The man, Zara's father, let out a tired breath. "So you chose your reputation over your daughter," he said softly. There was no accusation in his tone anymore, just a quiet sadness that felt heavier than anger ever could. Alina's shoulders shook as she cried, but her tears felt complicated, less about remorse and more about the collapse of the image she had built so carefully. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I was barely 22 when I got pregnant. I wasn't ready. I had plans, dreams. I knew what people would say. I knew how it would look." Her eyes flickered nervously toward the relatives gathered in the room, as though their opinions still mattered more to her than the child standing only a few feet away. The man, Zara's father, let out a tired breath. "So you chose your reputation over your daughter," he said softly. There was no accusation in his tone anymore, just a quiet sadness that felt heavier than anger ever could. Alina's shoulders shook as she cried, but her tears felt complicated, less about remorse and more about the collapse of the image she had built so carefully. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I was barely 22 when I got pregnant. I wasn't ready. I had plans, dreams. I knew what people would say. I knew how it would look." Her eyes flickered nervously toward the relatives gathered in the room, as though their opinions still mattered more to her than the child standing only a few feet away. The man, Zara's father, let out a tired breath. "So you chose your reputation over your daughter," he said softly. There was no accusation in his tone anymore, just a quiet sadness that felt heavier than anger ever could. Alina's shoulders shook as she cried, but her tears felt complicated, less about remorse and more about the collapse of the image she had built so carefully. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I was barely 22 when I got pregnant. I wasn't ready. I had plans, dreams. I knew what people would say. I knew how it would look." Her eyes flickered nervously toward the relatives gathered in the room, as though their opinions still mattered more to her than the child standing only a few feet away. The man, Zara's father, let out a tired breath. "So you chose your reputation over your daughter," he said softly. There was no accusation in his tone anymore, just a quiet sadness that felt heavier than anger ever could. Alina's shoulders shook as she cried, but her tears felt complicated, less about remorse and more about the collapse of the image she had built so carefully. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I was barely 22 when I got pregnant. I wasn't ready. I had plans, dreams. I knew what people would say. I knew how it would look." Her eyes flickered nervously toward the relatives gathered in the room, as though their opinions still mattered more to her than the child standing only a few feet away. The man, Zara's father, let out a tired breath. "So you chose your reputation over your daughter," he said softly. There was no accusation in his tone anymore, just a quiet sadness that felt heavier than anger ever could. Alina's shoulders shook as she cried, but her tears felt complicated, less about remorse and more about the collapse of the image she had built so carefully. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising.
The room remained wrapped in a tense silence that felt heavier with every passing second. I could hear Zara's small, uneven breaths as she leaned against me, her cheek pressed into my arm like she was trying to hide from everything happening around her. I instinctively rested my hand gently on her back, moving it in slow circles the way I had seen mothers do to comfort their children. It was such a simple motion, but I could feel her body gradually relaxing beneath my palm. That small response stirred something deep and unfamiliar inside me, a mixture of tenderness and an ache so quiet it almost felt sacred. My mother stood up slowly, her legs visibly unsteady. She took a hesitant step toward Zara, her voice trembling. "Come here, Beta," she said softly. "Let me see you." Zara looked up at me first, her eyes searching mine as if silently asking whether it was safe. When I gave her a gentle nod, she turned back toward my mother, though she didn't move from my side. My mother knelt down with surprising care, her hands shaking as she reached out to touch Zara's hair. The moment her fingers brushed those small pigtails, tears spilled down her cheeks. "You look just like her when she was little," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The same eyes." My father remained seated, his face pale, his gaze fixed on the floor for a long moment. But eventually, he looked up at Zara too, and I saw something soften in his expression. It wasn't acceptance yet. It was the quiet beginning of it, the kind that comes when reality has already broken through denial. Meanwhile, Alina stood frozen, as if she no longer knew where she belonged in that room. The center of attention she had always craved had shifted completely, but not in the way she had imagined. The spotlight now revealed her truth instead of her perfection. "You could have trusted us," my father finally said, his voice low and heavy. "We are your family. We would have helped you." Alina shook her head slowly, her tears falling faster now. "You say that now," she whispered, "but back then I knew how it would look. Everyone would have talked. I would have lost my chance to marry into a good family. I would have lost everything." Her words felt painfully honest and painfully shallow at the same time. The man beside her let out a quiet sigh. "You didn't lose everything," he said. "You gave it away." That sentence hung in the air, impossible to argue with. I saw Alina's shoulders slump, as though those words had finally struck a place deeper than her fear. Zara suddenly tugged at my sleeve, her voice soft. "Are you my auntie?" she asked, looking up at me with wide, uncertain eyes. The question caught me off guard. For a moment, I couldn't speak because my throat tightened unexpectedly. Then I smiled gently and nodded. "Yes," I said quietly, "I'm your auntie." Her face brightened just a little, the sadness in her eyes easing for a moment. "Can I stay with you?" she asked in a small voice. That simple question felt like it landed directly in my heart. Before I could answer, Alina finally reacted, stepping forward quickly. "Zara, you can stay with me," she said, her voice urgent, almost desperate. But Zara instinctively stepped closer to me instead, her small fingers gripping my hand tightly. That tiny movement said more than any words could. It revealed years of distance in a single silent gesture. I saw Alina's face crumple again, the realization hitting her harder than anything else had. It wasn't just that her secret had been exposed, it was that her own child didn't feel safe with her. My mother stood up slowly, her voice steadier now, though still heavy with emotion. "Enough," she said firmly. "This is not the time for arguments. The child is scared. She needs calm, not more pain." She looked at Alina with a sadness that carried both love and disappointment. "What's done cannot be undone, but what happens next, that still depends on you." Alina nodded weakly, wiping her tears, though she still looked lost. The man stepped closer to Zara, crouching down to her level. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "we should go home for now." Zara hesitated, looking between him and me, her expression torn. "Will I see Auntie again?" My chest tightened, and I knelt down so I was eye level with her. "Of course," I said softly, "any time you want." She studied my face carefully, as though memorizing it. Then, to my surprise, she suddenly wrapped her small arms around my neck in a quick, tight hug. It lasted only a few seconds, but it left something warm and aching in its wake. When she pulled back, she whispered, "You feel nice." Those 3 simple words hit me harder than anything else that day. Nice. Not perfect, not impressive, just safe, just kind. And in that moment, I realized something that settled deeply into my heart. All the years I had spent worrying about what I lacked, about being single, about not having children, about not fitting the picture others expected, none of it defined my worth. Because love, the real kind, isn't proven by appearances or status. It's proven in quiet moments, in the ability to make someone feel safe when they're hurting. As I watched Zara walk toward the door with her father, turning back once to wave at me, I felt something shift inside me completely. For the first time in years, the loneliness that had followed me so quietly felt lighter. After the front door closed behind Zara and her father, the silence that settled over the house felt even heavier than before. It was no longer the stunned quiet of shock. It was the kind of silence that comes when truth has finally stripped away all illusions, leaving only raw reality behind. The pastel decorations still hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly in the faint draft from the open windows, but now they looked almost mocking, like reminders of a celebration that had completely lost its meaning. No one returned to the party tables. No one touched the half-eaten cake. The laughter that had filled the house earlier felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. My mother sat back down slowly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her eyes were red, but her expression had shifted from disbelief to something quieter and more reflective. My father remained still for a long moment, then finally stood up, his movements heavy as though every step required effort. "Everyone should go home," he said quietly, addressing the relatives who were still lingering awkwardly in the room. "This is a family matter now." One by one, they began to leave, their murmured goodbyes hushed and uncomfortable. Some of them avoided looking at Alina entirely. Others glanced at her with a mixture of pity and judgment. I could see how each of those looks cut into her, even though she tried to keep her face composed. Within minutes, the house that had been crowded and noisy was nearly empty. Only the immediate family remained, my parents, Alina, and me. The stillness felt strangely intimate, like we were finally facing something we had all ignored for years. Alina sank onto the sofa, her shoulders slumped, her eyes swollen from crying. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, stripped of the confidence she had always worn like armor. "I didn't want it to happen this way," she whispered hoarsely. My mother sighed softly, a long, tired sound that carried both sadness and frustration. "Secrets never stay hidden forever," she said gently, "and when they come out, they always hurt more than the truth would have in the beginning." Alina covered her face with her hands, her voice muffled. "You don't understand how scared I was," she said. "Back then, everything felt like it would collapse if anyone found out. I thought I could fix it later, when the time was right." My father looked at her steadily. "There is no right time to hide a child," he said quietly. The firmness in his tone wasn't angry, it was sorrowful, the kind of disappointment that comes from broken trust. Alina's hands fell slowly into her lap. "I didn't think she would come back into my life like this," she admitted. I thought he would just keep raising her. I told myself she would be better off without me." The words hung in the air, and I felt something inside me tighten, because beneath the fear and selfishness in her decision, there was also something else. Shame. A shame so deep she had convinced herself that staying away was somehow the kinder choice. But shame, I realized, doesn't protect anyone. It only deepens wounds over time. My mother's voice softened. "A child never feels better off without a mother," she said gently, "even if the mother isn't perfect." That simple truth seemed to hit Alina harder than anything else. Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they looked different, not defensive, not panicked. They looked like the beginning of real remorse. For a long moment, no one spoke. I found myself staring at the empty doorway where Zara had stood earlier, remembering the way her small hand had gripped mine, the trust in her eyes, the quiet warmth of her brief hug. Something about that memory settled deeply inside me, steady and clear. Alina suddenly looked at me, her gaze hesitant, almost fearful. "You must hate me," she whispered. The question caught me off guard. I thought about it carefully before answering, because truthfully, hate wasn't what I felt. "No," I said quietly, "I don't hate you." She blinked, surprised, as if she had expected anger. "I'm just sad," I continued softly. "Sad that you were so afraid of being imperfect that you ended up hurting yourself and her the most." My words weren't harsh, but they were honest, and honesty, I've learned, can sometimes feel sharper than anger. Alina lowered her gaze, absorbing that truth in silence. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted finally, her voice trembling. My father stepped closer to her, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "You don't fix it all at once," he said gently. "You start by telling the truth. Then you take responsibility for what comes next." His words carried a quiet strength that seemed to steady her slightly. I realized then that this moment wasn't just about exposure, it was about a choice, whether she would continue hiding behind fear or finally step forward and accept the consequences of her actions. As I stood there watching her struggle with that decision, I felt a calm clarity settle inside me. Earlier that day, I had walked into that house feeling small, ashamed, and judged for being single. But now, after everything that had unfolded, I saw my life in a completely different light. Being alone had never meant being incomplete. It had given me the freedom to grow into someone capable of compassion without fear, someone who could offer warmth without expecting anything in return. And in that quiet realization, I felt something unexpected: peace. That night, long after the decorations had been taken down and the cake had been packed away untouched, I lay awake in my apartment staring at the ceiling. The house felt unusually quiet, But it wasn't the same kind of loneliness I used to feel. It was heavier, thoughtful. My mind kept replaying Zara's small voice asking, "Did I do something bad?" and the way she had hugged me before leaving. I had always imagined motherhood as something that either happened or didn't, something decided by marriage and timing and fate. But that afternoon had cracked that belief wide open. Love, I realized, doesn't wait for perfect circumstances. It simply appears where it's needed. The next morning, my phone rang earlier than usual. I didn't need to look at the screen to know it was my mother. Her voice sounded tired but steadier than the day before. "Your sister didn't sleep," she said softly. "She's been crying all night. She wants to see Zara." I sat up slowly, my heart tightening. "Has she called him?" I asked. There was a pause. "She's afraid," my mother admitted. Of course she was. Fear had been steering her decisions for years, but fear couldn't be allowed to steer this one, too. "She has to be the one to call," I said gently. "It can't come from anyone else." Later that afternoon, Alina called me herself. Her voice was fragile, stripped of its usual confidence. "Will you come with me?" she asked quietly. The vulnerability in her tone surprised me. For the first time, she wasn't trying to defend herself or justify her choices. She sounded like a younger sister again, lost and unsure. I hesitated only briefly. "Yes," I said. When we arrived at Zara's father's apartment, the building looked modest but well cared for. I could see small potted plants by the entrance and colorful chalk drawings on the walkway, probably made by children who lived there. Alina's hands trembled as we stood in front of the door. "What if she doesn't want to see me?" she whispered. I looked at her carefully. "Then you accept that, but you still show up." She nodded slowly and knocked. When the door opened, Zara's father looked at us with guarded eyes. There was no anger there now, just caution. "We came to talk," Alina said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He steadied her face for a moment, then stepped aside to let us in. Zara was sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by crayons and coloring books. When she looked up and saw us, her body stiffened slightly. She glanced at me first, and when she recognized me, her expression softened. "Auntie?" she said quietly. That single word filled the room with something fragile but hopeful. Alina swallowed hard and slowly knelt down a few feet away from her. "Hi, Zara," she said gently. The child didn't run to her this time. She stayed where she was, watching carefully. "Are you still mad?" Zara asked in a small voice. Alina's eyes filled instantly. "No," she whispered. "I was never mad at you." She took a shaky breath. "I was scared, and I made a mistake." The honesty in her tone felt different from the day before. It wasn't defensive, it was raw. Zara tilted her head slightly. "Did you not want me?" she asked. The question landed softly this time, not like a knife, but like a fragile piece of glass waiting to be handled carefully. Alina's voice broke. "I didn't know how to be your mommy," she said honestly. "But that doesn't mean I didn't want you." Zara seemed to consider that carefully, her small brows furrowed. Children have a way of sensing truth without understanding every detail. Slowly, she stood up and walked a step closer, not fully closing the distance, but not pulling away either. Watching them, I felt my chest tighten again. This wasn't a dramatic reunion. It wasn't instant forgiveness. It was something quieter and more real, the slow beginning of repair. Zara's father remained nearby, observing silently. I could see years of protectiveness in his posture, but also relief. He wasn't here to fight. He was here for his daughter. After a few minutes, Zara picked up one of her crayons and held it out toward Alina. "Do you want to color?" she asked shyly. It wasn't a hug. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was an invitation, and sometimes that's how healing begins. Alina nodded quickly, sitting down on the floor beside her. Their shoulders didn't touch at first, but as they leaned over the coloring book together, I saw the smallest shift, Zara inching slightly closer without realizing it. I felt tears prick my eyes again, but this time they carried something different. Hope. Quiet, cautious hope. As I watched them, I realized something else, too. I wasn't there to replace anyone. I wasn't there to rescue or control. I was there simply to witness and to support, and in doing that, I felt more complete than I ever had when chasing society's expectations of what my life should look like. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a strange new rhythm, one that none of us had expected but slowly began to accept. The storm of that baby shower day didn't disappear overnight. It lingered in quiet conversations, in hesitant phone calls, in the careful way we all chose our words around one another. But beneath that awkwardness, something else was forming, a fragile, honest rebuilding of relationships that had once been defined by appearances instead of truth. Alina started visiting Zara regularly, always with a nervousness that never fully left her. The first few visits were stiff and uncertain. Zara would sit close to her father, watching Alina carefully, responding politely but without warmth. It was clear that trust, once broken or never fully formed, couldn't be repaired with apologies alone. It needed time, consistency, and patience. And for someone like Alina, who had spent years trying to control how others saw her, that slow process was painfully unfamiliar. I saw it in the way her voice would tremble when she spoke to Zara, in the way she sometimes hesitated before reaching out to touch her, as if afraid her presence might still be unwelcome. But she kept showing up, and that, I realized, was the most important change of all. One afternoon, about a month after everything had been revealed, I went with Alina to pick Zara up from her preschool. It was the first time Zara would spend the afternoon at our parents' house. I could see the anxiety in Alina's posture as we waited outside the small gate. She kept smoothing her dress nervously, her eyes scanning the playground. "What if she doesn't want to come?" she whispered. I glanced at her gently. "Then we respect that," I said, "but we still keep trying." When Zara finally came out holding her teacher's hand, her eyes lit up when she saw me. "Auntie!" she called, running toward me without hesitation. That simple reaction still warmed me every time. She slowed slightly when she noticed Alina standing beside me. There was a brief moment of uncertainty in her expression, but this time she didn't step back. She just looked up at her quietly. Alina crouched down slowly, her voice soft. "Hi, Zara." The little girl nodded. "Hi." It wasn't affectionate, but it wasn't distant either. It was neutral, and that, in their situation, was progress. "Would you like to come visit Grandma and Grandpa today?" Alina asked, gently. Zara glanced at me before answering. When I smiled encouragingly, she nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. That single word made relief flood across Alina's face so clearly that it almost brought tears to my own eyes. At my parents' house, the atmosphere was very different from the day of the baby shower. There were no decorations, no crowds, just quiet warmth. My mother had spent the entire morning cooking Zara's favorite foods after asking her father what she liked. When Zara walked into the house, my mother knelt down and opened her arms gently, not forcing, just inviting. This time, Zara stepped into that embrace without hesitation. Watching that moment, I felt a quiet sense of healing ripple through the room. My father, who had been the most reserved since the revelation, slowly softened too. He would sit with Zara in the evenings, helping her build small puzzles or showing her old photo albums. He didn't speak much, but the patience in his presence said everything. And Alina? She changed in ways I never expected. The sharp, defensive edge in her personality began to fade. She stopped worrying about appearances, about what people might say. Instead, she focused entirely on learning how to be present for Zara. I saw her sitting on the floor for hours playing with dolls, reading bedtime stories, listening to Zara's small worries about school or friendships. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness, of hesitation. Sometimes Zara would still reach for her father first when she felt scared. But slowly, gradually, she began to reach for Alina too. And each time she did, I saw how deeply it moved my sister, how those small gestures meant more to her than any social approval ever had. One evening, as I watched them together from the doorway, I felt something settle quietly inside me. I realized that the life I had once thought I lacked, the warmth of family, the connection of motherhood, had found its way to me in an entirely different form, not through marriage, not through traditional expectations, but through something far more genuine, the simple, steady presence of love where it was needed most. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a strange new rhythm, one that none of us had expected but slowly began to accept. The storm of that baby shower day didn't disappear overnight. It lingered in quiet conversations, in hesitant phone calls, in the careful way we all chose our words around one another. But beneath that awkwardness, something else was forming, a fragile, honest rebuilding of relationships that had once been defined by appearances instead of truth. Alina started visiting Zara regularly, always with a nervousness that never fully left her. The first few visits were stiff and uncertain. Zara would sit close to her father, watching Alina carefully, responding politely but without warmth. It was clear that trust, once broken or never fully formed, couldn't be repaired with apologies alone. It needed time, consistency, and patience. And for someone like Alina, who had spent years trying to control how others saw her, that slow process was painfully unfamiliar. I saw it in the way her voice would tremble when she spoke to Zara, in the way she sometimes hesitated before reaching out to touch her, as if afraid her presence might still be unwelcome. But she kept showing up, and that, I realized, was the most important change of all. One afternoon, about a month after everything had been revealed, I went with Alina to pick Zara up from her preschool. It was the first time Zara would spend the afternoon at our parents' house. I could see the anxiety in Alina's posture as we waited outside the small gate. She kept smoothing her dress nervously, her eyes scanning the playground. "What if she doesn't want to come?" she whispered. I glanced at her gently. "Then we respect that," I said, "but we still keep trying." When Zara finally came out holding her teacher's hand, her eyes lit up when she saw me. "Auntie!" she called, running toward me without hesitation. That simple reaction still warmed me every time. She slowed slightly when she noticed Alina standing beside me. There was a brief moment of uncertainty in her expression, but this time she didn't step back. She just looked up at her quietly. Alina crouched down slowly, her voice soft. "Hi, Zara." The little girl nodded. "Hi." It wasn't affectionate, but it wasn't distant either. It was neutral, and that, in their situation, was progress. "Would you like to come visit Grandma and Grandpa today?" Alina asked, gently. Zara glanced at me before answering. When I smiled encouragingly, she nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. That single word made relief flood across Alina's face so clearly that it almost brought tears to my own eyes. At my parents' house, the atmosphere was very different from the day of the baby shower. There were no decorations, no crowds, just quiet warmth. My mother had spent the entire morning cooking Zara's favorite foods after asking her father what she liked. When Zara walked into the house, my mother knelt down and opened her arms gently, not forcing, just inviting. This time, Zara stepped into that embrace without hesitation. Watching that moment, I felt a quiet sense of healing ripple through the room. My father, who had been the most reserved since the revelation, slowly softened too. He would sit with Zara in the evenings, helping her build small puzzles or showing her old photo albums. He didn't speak much, but the patience in his presence said everything. And Alina? She changed in ways I never expected. The sharp, defensive edge in her personality began to fade. She stopped worrying about appearances, about what people might say. Instead, she focused entirely on learning how to be present for Zara. I saw her sitting on the floor for hours playing with dolls, reading bedtime stories, listening to Zara's small worries about school or friendships. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness, of hesitation. Sometimes Zara would still reach for her father first when she felt scared. But slowly, gradually, she began to reach for Alina too. And each time she did, I saw how deeply it moved my sister, how those small gestures meant more to her than any social approval ever had. One evening, as I watched them together from the doorway, I felt something settle quietly inside me. I realized that the life I had once thought I lacked, the warmth of family, the connection of motherhood, had found its way to me in an entirely different form, not through marriage, not through traditional expectations, but through something far more genuine, the simple, steady presence of love where it was needed most. As the months passed, the changes in our family became impossible to ignore. The house that once revolved around appearances and quiet comparisons slowly transformed into a place where honesty felt safer than perfection. Conversations that used to be filled with subtle judgments now carried something softer, understanding, even humility. It wasn't an instant shift. There were still difficult moments, still quiet reminders of the past, but the difference was that we no longer pretended those wounds didn't exist. We faced them, gently but openly. Zara became a steady presence in all of our lives. She spent most of her time with her father, of course, but she visited our parents' home almost every weekend. At first, she came cautiously, as if unsure whether the warmth she received would remain consistent. But over time, her laughter grew freer, her steps more confident, her small voice filling the house with a lightness we hadn't known before. My mother adored her in a quiet, deeply grateful way. She often told me that Zara's presence felt like a second chance, an opportunity to give love that had once been delayed by fear and secrecy. My father, though less expressive, showed his affection in simple gestures. He would bring home small coloring books or help Zara water the plants in the garden, guiding her tiny hands with surprising patience. But the most profound transformation was in Alina. The sister I had grown up with, the one who thrived on attention, who measured her worth through approval, began to fade into the background of her own life. In her place emerged someone quieter, more reflective. She no longer spoke about how things looked to others. She spoke about how Zara felt. She stopped comparing herself to anyone else, including me. Instead, she asked questions, real questions about how to be a better mother, how to build trust slowly, how to handle the guilt she still carried. One evening, after Zara had fallen asleep on the couch during a movie night, Alina and I sat together in the kitchen. The soft glow of the overhead light cast gentle shadows across the table, and the house was unusually peaceful. She stared at her hands for a long time before speaking. "I used to think you were the one who was missing out," she said quietly. "I thought being single meant you were incomplete." I listened without interrupting, sensing how much courage it took for her to say those words. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with something I had never seen in them before, humility. "But now I see you were never missing anything. You had peace. You had freedom to become someone strong without hurting others along the way." Her voice trembled slightly. "I was the one who was empty. I just didn't realize it." For a moment, I didn't know how to respond, because the truth was, I had once believed her version of the story too. I had spent years wondering if something was wrong with me for not fitting the life everyone expected, but hearing her say this now felt like the final piece of something settling into place. We all learn at different times, I said gently. What matters is that you're learning now. Tears filled her eyes again, though they didn't fall. I hurt you so many times, especially that day at the baby shower. I don't know how you forgave me. I thought about that carefully before answering. Forgiveness didn't happen in one moment, I said softly. It happened when I saw how much fear you had been carrying, and when I saw Zara. She needed love more than anyone needed blame. Alina nodded slowly, absorbing that truth. That night, as I watched her carefully cover Zara with a blanket before carrying her to bed, I realized something else. Healing in a family doesn't come from pretending everything is perfect. It comes from the willingness to admit imperfection and to keep choosing love despite it. And in that realization, I felt something inside me finally settle completely. A quiet, steady sense of fulfillment that had nothing to do with marriage or status or society's expectations. It came from knowing that my life, just as it was, had value, purpose, and deep connection. Nearly a year after that unforgettable baby shower, our family gathered again in the same house, but this time the atmosphere felt completely different. There were no tense smiles, no hidden truths pressing against the walls. Instead, the air carried something warm and steady, like a quiet sense of acceptance that had been earned through time and honesty. The occasion wasn't a formal celebration. It was something simpler, Zara's 5th birthday. My mother had insisted on hosting it, determined to give her granddaughter a joyful memory that belonged only to love, not secrets. As I stood in the kitchen watching her carefully arrange small cupcakes on a tray, I couldn't help noticing how much lighter she seemed. The lines of worry that had once marked her face had softened. She hummed quietly to herself, pausing now and then to check that everything was perfect, not for appearances, but for Zara's happiness. When Zara arrived, she ran straight into the house with the boundless excitement only children possess. "Auntie," she called the moment she saw me, throwing her arms around my waist. I laughed softly, hugging her back. Her presence had become something steady in my life, a reminder that love often finds us in unexpected forms. Behind her, Alina followed more slowly, carrying a small gift bag, but her posture no longer carried the tension it once had. There was a calmness in her movements now, a groundedness that came from months of facing her past honestly and choosing differently each day. Zara tugged her hand eagerly. "Mommy, come see my cake," she said, her voice bright with excitement. That single word, "mommy," still held a quiet power every time I heard it. It wasn't spoken casually, it was spoken with growing trust, built piece by piece over time. I saw Alina's eyes soften as she followed Zara into the living room, her smile warm and genuine. The transformation between them had not been instant nor flawless. There were still moments when Zara would instinctively turn to her father first for reassurance, but now she reached for Alina too, sometimes without even thinking. And that quiet shift was proof of how deeply consistent love can repair even the most fragile bonds. As the afternoon unfolded, laughter filled the house in a way that felt completely natural. Zara showed everyone her drawings, her favorite toys, her carefully practiced dance moves. My father clapped loudly, pretending to be more amazed than he probably was. My mother wiped tears of happiness when Zara blew out her candles. And Alina, she simply watched her daughter with an expression of gratitude that never left her face. Later, after the guests had gone and the house had quieted, I stepped out into the garden for some fresh air. The evening sky was painted in soft shades of orange and purple. the kind of calm beauty that feels almost symbolic after a long, difficult journey. Alina joined me a few minutes later, standing beside me in silence for a while. "Do you ever think about how everything could have turned out differently?" she asked quietly. I considered her question carefully. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but not with regret, more with understanding." She nodded slowly. "I used to believe that being strong meant never showing weakness, that love had to look perfect from the outside. But now I know strength is something else entirely." She glanced toward the house, where Zara's laughter drifted faintly through the open window. "It's about being honest, about showing up even when you're afraid." Her words carried a quiet clarity that only comes from lived experience. I smiled gently. "You learned that the hard way," I said softly. She gave a small, rueful laugh. "Yes, but I'm grateful I learned it at all." We stood there in comfortable silence for a moment longer, watching the sky darken gradually. And as I reflected on everything that had happened, the humiliation I once felt, the painful exposure of hidden truths, the slow rebuilding of trust, I realized how profoundly my own perspective had changed. For years, I had measured my life against society's expectations, believing I was somehow incomplete because I didn't follow the traditional path. But now, I saw things differently. My life wasn't defined by what I lacked. It was defined by the love I gave and received, by the quiet strength I had built, and by the unexpected connections that had enriched my world in ways I never could have predicted. And in that realization, I felt something deep and steady settle inside me, a sense of fulfillment that no external validation could ever replace. The days that followed felt almost ordinary, and yet they carried a weight of quiet healing that I had never experienced before. Zara became a regular presence in our lives, not as a secret or a disruption, but as a living, breathing reminder of how fragile and precious trust could be. She would run to our parents' house on weekends, dragging small bags filled with her favorite toys, eager to share every little detail of her life with us. Alina, for her part, transformed in ways that went far beyond what I had imagined possible. She was no longer the sister who measured everything by appearances, who flaunted perfection like armor. She was patient, gentle, and deliberate. Watching her navigate this new life was humbling and, in a way, inspiring. I realized that the woman I had once envied had become someone I deeply respected, not because of the mistakes she had made, but because of the courage it took to face them. One Saturday afternoon, my parents' house was buzzing with the soft chaos of children at play. My cousins had joined in for a small gathering, but the center of the tension was, as always, Zara. She had discovered a set of paints and was carefully decorating a piece of cardboard with the most vibrant colors she could find. Alina crouched beside her, guiding her hands and quietly encouraging her creativity. I watched them from the doorway, leaning against the frame, and felt a wave of emotions wash over me. Relief, yes, but also gratitude and an unexpected sense of pride. I realized that my role in this story wasn't just as an observer. By standing beside Alina, by offering a safe presence to Zara, by refusing to let fear or resentment dictate my actions, I had helped shape a small, healing corner of the world. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic, but it was real, and it mattered. Later, as the sun began to dip behind the trees, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and gold, Alina and I sat together on the back porch. Zara had run ahead to chase a butterfly, her laughter ringing out across the yard. "Do you ever regret how things happened?" she asked quietly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I considered that." "Sometimes," I admitted, "but not in a way that hurts me anymore. Regret doesn't change the past. What matters is what you do now." She nodded, her eyes glistening with understanding. "I never knew how much I was missing," she said. "I thought I had to be perfect to hide everything, to control how people saw me. But love is messier than that, and it's worth it." Her words lingered between us like the warm evening air. I reached out and took her hand gently. "You're learning that now," I said softly, "and that's what counts." The days that followed continued to test us in small, quiet ways. There were disagreements over bedtime routines, moments when Zara would cling to her father and refuse to acknowledge Alina, and times when old patterns of fear and pride threatened to creep back into her mother's behavior. But every time, Alina chose differently. She showed up, she apologized, she stayed. And each choice, each act of honesty and consistency slowly rebuilt the fragile trust that had once been fractured. And through it all, I learned more about myself than I ever thought possible. I learned that love isn't about status or perfection. It isn't about having a title, a spouse, or a traditional family structure. Love is about showing up, day after day, even when it's uncomfortable. It's about facing mistakes and choosing compassion over judgment. And sometimes it's about being the steady presence that others can rely on when they don't yet know how to trust themselves. On a quiet evening, as I tucked Zara into bed at my parents' house, she looked up at me with those wide, trusting eyes. "Auntie," she said softly, "I'm glad you're here." The words were simple, but they carried more weight than anyone had ever said to me. I kissed the top of her head gently and whispered, "So am I, Beta. So am I." That night, as I drove home, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't known I needed. The humiliation of that baby shower, the sharp words, the envy and self-doubt, they all felt like a distant shadow now. They had been necessary, in a strange way, to lead to this moment of clarity. Life hadn't followed the path I had imagined. It hadn't been perfect, neat, or predictable, but it had given me something deeper, the understanding that my worth was never defined by what I lacked, and that love, in its truest form, can grow in the most unexpected ways. And as I pulled into my driveway, I finally smiled, not with relief, not with arrogance, but with quiet certainty. I was enough, my life was enough, and the bonds of family, once fractured by fear and secrecy, had begun to shine with the steady, forgiving light of truth. That day, I realized the most profound lesson of all. The measure of a life well lived isn't perfection. It's the courage to face our flaws, the willingness to show up for others, and the grace to accept love when it finds us, even in the most unexpected, messy, and beautiful ways.